mentioned to my sister a few weeks back that I would be giving a talk today, and naturally she asked what the topic would be, and I said, obedience. She said, obedience? What do you mean, like the virtue of obedience? And obedient to who? And then I said, well, you'll have to come to the talk to find out. And I think I know she was anticipating that answer because she said those words along with me. Well, she couldn't make it. But the thing is, when she asked, I sincerely didn't know the angle, at least, that I was going to take. I knew the topic, just not the angle with regards to obedience. I knew that it was a subject that the Holy Spirit had placed in my heart for some time, especially within the context of my holy hours, if not for the sake of my own soul, but also for the sake of anyone who wished to hear what this priest had to say on the matter. Well, before knowing the precise tact that I would take, sorry, I just popped the microphone, I considered enough to be able to establish a title for this reflection. And so the title is Obedience, a Discarded Peace, the Forgotten Freedom, because I recognized that in our current society, obedience, just in general, as a principle, whether or not you refer to it as a virtue or even care, about who we are to be obedient to, but it has been rather remarkably discarded and forgotten. But to discard and forget means that once upon a time, we remembered and we had it. We upheld it. We valued it. And so, before I get into where it went, just briefly, I want to explain why this talk is billed as a reflection, because it is just that, it's a reflection. I'm not here to explicate obedience as a virtue or to necessarily teach or instruct you. The people who need that the most would never come to a talk like this. And such is the case of the Catholic Church when it comes to a lot of things. And so this isn't a class, and it's certainly not a lecture. Of course, I'd be delighted if it turns out that you do learn something. That's great. But it isn't really a retreat either, and I was very specific that we advertised it, marketed it, not as a retreat, because that's rather involved, can be rather involved. Because in seminary, we had all these things, right? So we had plenty of classes, plenty of lectures. I thought I would never step foot in the classroom again, and at 35, here I am, shoulder to shoulder with collegians. But we also had one retreat per year, as it is it's actually a canonical requirement when you're preparing for the priesthood, and then as well as once you're finally ordained a priest, and thank God it's so. I love going on retreat. I love it. But in seminary, and the ones that we have in our diocese at least, they're 5 days. And so, whether or not you physically go somewhere on retreat, that's what we think of the most. It's helpful, change of scenery, but it's the length of time removed from your normal routine and immersed in prayer, which makes it so fruitful. And so led by a retreat director, it's meant to be very meditative and usually engaged in a particular theme germane to the particular audience. So when you're in seminary, there's a lot of things you can choose from. Let me just put it that way. But you can't exactly pull off a 5-day retreat at a parish. It's just really not tenable, as much as I think we would all benefit from something like that. just logistical problems, commitments, time commitments for all of you, the priest giving the talks. It's just not possible. But it was these days of reflection that we had in seminary. Usually a day off from classes. Sometimes we'd go off campus, we'd go somewhere else, but it was usually just in the seminary. And Mass would be later in the morning, so you get to sleep in a little bit. And there would be one, maybe two talks, kind of like I'm doing today, by a visiting bishop or priest, maybe even one of our own on staff. It was often one that we had there. And the point was not to be in a classroom setting, right? So the point was also not to exercise or rather experience some profound awakening in the soul, right? It's just a reflection. Time out to reflect on something that we probably already knew. And so you already know obedience, and you know at least what it is abstractly and individually at a certain level as well. But is this not just a more formal way, what we're doing today, to do what we do when we meditate on Scripture? We should be doing on a daily basis, reflection. I mean, especially the passages that we're already familiar with. I mean, think about the one we had at Mass this morning, how often we've heard that. And yet, I don't know about you, but I hear something different every time. I know the words, I know the Scripture, but I'm reflecting on it, I'm revisiting it. And something new, a different perspective, or a deeper appreciation seems to be manifested. And so this is what I hope happens for you this morning during our short time together as we reflect together on the virtue of obedience and how tremendously underrated I think it has become, certainly within the context of obeying God the Father and Holy Mother Church, but also just what goes missing when we are not even inclined to obey. When it comes to things like marriage or having children or some of the trickier and delicate concepts in sexual morality, I'm not an expert. In that I really don't know from experience. How could I? And so I often wonder how much credibility many of these couples give me, whom I'm preparing for marriage. They must think, as they're sitting there in my office across the desk from me, and they're like, sure, you're wearing a collar, you got these degrees on your wall, you may know a lot about a lot of things, but when it comes to you as a priest, not married, not able to have children, not in a position to experience firsthand the situations and the complications which will naturally arise, inevitably arise, in what we hope to be a lasting marriage, where do you get off telling us what to expect? With all due respect, why are you even the one preparing us for marriage? So to be clear, I've never gotten this. No one's ever said anything even remotely like this to me. Maybe in the future someone will. And these are just a few examples of concrete examples of things I might have learned about in seminary and just growing up, being a man, growing up in society. But to know from experience, I actually wouldn't blame anyone if they had these thoughts about me. And so while I don't intend to be too terribly cerebral this morning, I would like to point out the fact that obedience is a topic I know quite a bit about. Perhaps less academically so, but more through experience. I mean, I live obedience. I know I only have 2 years under my belt, but I promise you I've had many difficult lessons when it comes to manifesting my obedience as a priest in the Catholic Church. I also know many priests who have relative horror stories when it comes to being obedient in this vocation. Now, I can't speak for them, but even when it's tough to be obedient as a priest, I can't express how truly freeing obedience remains. As I said, I think we've lost it in more ways than one. We've lost a concept of obedience. I believe we had it, we understood it, and then we lost it. Or we were at least much better about being obedient, and then as of late, we couldn't care less. But when we did have it, it's not like we always had it. And so I think of a time not that long ago. I mean, in my lifetime, relatively speaking, it is a long time ago, but a simpler time, the early 80s. So early 80s, I was 7, 8. I could play outside. Innocent, for the most part, at that age. I knew the rules of the house, right? And most of them extended outside. Especially when it comes to how you treat others, respecting others. But then also, what dangers to look out for, how far I could venture off, what time to be home, etc. I knew all those things. It's because I was responsible, again, for the most part. Because my parents instilled responsibility in me. And it seemed that all my neighbor friends seemed to have the same kind of thing going on in their families. I remember not knowing many kids, I actually can't think of one right now, but many kids in school who didn't have a mother and a father in the home. And so when it came to our first experiences of manifesting obedience, that is, honoring thy father and thy mother, it seemed we all had some pretty good role models. And that virtually all of my friends' fathers were honoring their wives, as well as the reverse. Our mothers were honoring their husbands. And so talk about offering some credibility when it comes to teaching something. It's not that they just read it in a book. They were instilling some very important concepts to their children very effectively because they lived it. Now, I don't know what might have happened, what might have been going on in secret in some of these homes. But the proof is often in the pudding. That is, the children from these homes, and, they just seem normal. I met most of their parents, too, and they seemed normal, whatever you want to interpret normal to be. They're just well-adjusted. Of course, I knew my own mom and dad intimately well, and the healthy and happy home that they provided for my sisters and I. But on top of my friends and I knowing right from wrong, and that we had examples of it, there seemed to be a lot less law-breaking, creepy, dangerous adults running around the world snatching kids. So we could play outside. Now, I lived in a small town in Pennsylvania, so much of what I just told you could be chalked up, I guess, to rural America in the early 80s. But rural America, in what is now almost 2020, is different. So much is different, much for the worse. Not the least of which are the statistics of those who are separated and divorced. They're staggering. They've been staggering for a while, but they continue to rise. And I think kids these days are often hard-pressed to find a friend at school or in the neighborhood whose parents are still together. And I'm not just talking about rural America, even though that remains to be the safer place. But the closer to cities you go, all of this just gets dramatically more rampant. And then the horrific things some so-called adults are on the prowl to do with children these days. Not to mention what kids themselves get into these days. Ridiculous, sinful, dangerous behaviors, and they're learned at such a scandalous young age. Many because, their friends are doing it. And I'm not just talking about kids being kids or some rebellious stage that they all go through. But horrible, life-threatening, sometimes life-taking decisions. And when it comes to sexual sins, it's a tragedy how young boys and girls often start engaging in them. It's unreal. But guess where they learn these behaviors? Often the home. And if they don't witness it directly in the people they live with, because honestly, sometimes these people aren't even blood relatives in some situations. Well, there's plenty on TV, which they get to watch, often completely unmonitored. And so where we are now, not just in rural America and urban America, but where we are as a global society, continues to trend in the wrong direction. I mean, the trend is even more pronounced when we look back not just 40 years, but 50, 60, 70 years into the golden era of this country. Now, I know the world saw terrible wars in these times with incredible suffering and tremendous blood loss, bloodshed. And I don't mean to discount them. I mean, if anything, the actions of the veterans of these wars, living and deceased, were due to their obedience to their commanding officer. But when it comes to a basic appreciation and prolific examples of obedience and just well-ordered living, especially in the family, it seems the further back we go, the more we had it. The more we had it together. Of course, we know that human history extends back much further than the microcosm of just one particular century. And many of our human characteristics in general terms, so our vices, our virtues, the good and the bad, the sinful or benign, because here I'm not just talking about the virtue of obedience, but many things which have come and gone as different eras have also come and gone. Because not all of our historical eras have been golden. Let's face that. We have had world wars which greatly affect the psychology and behaviors and just the outlook of mankind. They're were world wars even before we got to calling them so. I mean, because the known world was much smaller back then. But not just wars, plagues, natural disasters. And so if we look all the way back, through it all the way back to creation, and now specifically with regards to obedience, what do we find? Well, the fall of Adam and Eve. That among our first human traits as a man and a woman is this proclivity of disobedience. It's really the primal sin. And you might be like, well, wait, I thought pride takes that spot. Well, pride is certainly the root of all evil. But if you want to continue to speak about evil as a plant, if pride is the root, the underneath, the foundation, disobedience is the visible part from above ground. You can point to it. It's the tangible sin, if you will. But really those words don't go together, tangible and sin. And as you might have picked up on, this analogy quickly breaks down. Because plants are living. They grow. They're fruitful. But evil and sin are decay and death. One thing leads to another, just as pride leads to disobedience. Now, ever since the fall, as man and woman multiplied, populating the earth, and later civilization, mankind has ebbed and flowed being obedient to its Creator. We are sometimes painfully aware of this on an individual level, where we've sinned and our conscience tells us so, and then we turn back to God, and then again, later, turn away from Him, and the pattern continues. This pattern can also be seen throughout human history. So every great covenant that God established with the men and women of His creation was a reorientation, a profound and undeniable picking us up as a people and facing us in the right direction. Because for we had been going in the wrong direction, not obeying the eternal law placed in our hearts by virtue of being created by an eternal being. So each time, each covenant established something more specific to encourage us to remain obedient, to remain faithful to God. And as we learn later, because of the final covenant, if we were to ever fail in our obedience, because God knows us so well. Of course, God never took away, nor would He ever take away, our freedom, our free will. And so in the wake of each covenant, we drifted again. We became wayward again. And so we have God's covenant with Noah, promising never again to destroy life, human or otherwise, by flood. The covenant with Abraham, establishing a great nation apologize. A great nation of all his descendants, but without any stipulations, meaning it was unconditional and open to everybody. Moses, through whom God establishes a covenant with the Israelites, a people peculiarly his own, because he recognizes that not all of humanity, even with divine help, even with a kick in the pants, wishes to obey the blueprint of right living inscribed in their hearts. And in so doing, he does not write anybody off. He just recognizes that some people, and many people at that, will continue to write him off. And so he establishes a covenant with the Israelites who had been enslaved. He does so prophetically through Moses and gives them the 10 Commandments written on a couple of stone tablets, but commandments which would have already existed in their hearts, even if they ignored them. And then the priestly covenant with Aaron and his descendants, the Davidic covenant, wherein a kingship is established here on earth. Also that when Jesus comes into the world, God incarnate, to save people from their sins once and for all, the recourse I mentioned earlier, his kingdom will truly be established on earth, not just in reality, but also in a way in which we understand as human beings, so that those who follow him, those who are baptized, are truly priest, prophet, and king. And not independently so, but mutually inclusive identity as sons and daughters of God Most High, baptized into the life and death of Jesus Christ. In his first letter, St. Peter calls the Christian faithful a royal priesthood. In other words, a kingly priesthood, one with a royal lineage. And does this not echo Exodus 19, verse 6, where the Lord calls his chosen people, Israel, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation? Peter is alluding to the continuity between Israel in the Old Testament and the Christian church. Of course, I mean the Catholic Church, which they were one and the same for 1,000 years. And so we note the parallel between the Israel of God in the Old Covenant, which is made up of many individual, interrelated, chronological covenants, and the church established by Jesus Christ, the everlasting covenant, which does not hinge upon what comes next, because there is nothing more to be revealed. There is nothing more to come except Jesus Christ when he comes again. This time not veiled in a perceived weak human form, but in all his divine glory to judge the living and the dead. Because he is God, which he always was. He always is. I am, he says. Let's take a short break. Stretch your legs, use the restroom if you need to, and we'll come back, let's just say quarter after. Between quarter after and 20 after. Okay? So I was chatting with the Ma family on our break, and I was telling them that I don't think my one microphone was plugged in during the last talk, so I'm working with 3 this morning. I've got this directional one, which doesn't move when I do. Then these 2 which do. One is for the recording, for posterity's sake or something like that. But then the other one is something I've been using during my Sunday homilies to kind of work in tandem with this. So as I move, now I think I am a little louder than the last segment. It was supposed to be on, but I think that's what was causing the crackling. I would bump into it, and you just gotta love technology. Actually, I hate it sometimes, but welcome back. So earlier, I said obedience is tremendously underrated. Now, I didn't mean to stop there as if people who aren't obedient or who don't engage in obedience are merely missing out on something, right? Which is entirely true. They're missing out on freedom and immense peace. But it's not just a matter of going through life without one or both of these discernible benefits if we are not obedient, otherwise fine without them. How could we possibly be fine without freedom and peace? It's because I think people think they can find these things elsewhere. And not just a watered down version of them, but actually a better version, a true version in their estimation, on the outside of obedience, as it were. Like the prodigal son, who thought he could find these things away from home. A growing number of people truly believe that freedom and peace, and for these individuals, I think we can group those terms together as happiness, because I don't think they really see a discernible difference, or freedom they might understand, whereas peace is just some figure of speech, which really doesn't exist at all. This is them talking, not me. But when it comes to those things, however they perceive them, they are most pure, the most perfect manifestation, when no body or no thing is telling them what they can or cannot do. But the reality is, as we know, as God's obedient sons and daughters, that anyone outside of him, outside of a conscious or even unconscious obedience to his eternal laws, is actually enslaved. So, the opposite of peace and freedom. Existing, yes, but unhappy. Although they probably won't admit it. Although some eventually do. Again, like the prodigal son, who was in a state so pathetic, he could not even dine with sows. I mean, that's pretty low. Unhappy, like those Israelites under the whip and mercilessness of Pharaoh before they began their exodus. Truly worse for the wear. And so the natural question becomes, but were not the Israelites practicing obedience to Pharaoh? Were they not obeying someone or something, even if it was to their detriment? And I'd like to offer the very bipartisan answer of yes and no. Yes, it can be considered that the Israelites were obedient to Pharaoh. Every single one of them could have laid down their hammer or whatever tool they were given and refused to work, or just stay in the tent and I don't know what they lived in back then, tents, I guess. Stay in the tent and sleep in, right? It's a terribly hot Egyptian summer day. I don't want to go to work today. Of course, they would have been refused food and shelter, maybe tortured, if they weren't killed outright. Because who wants dead weight? Pharaoh certainly didn't. And so they most likely obeyed Pharaoh, did his bidding, because they were under duress. All of them would have been under duress. Fear and torture, fear of torture and death, these things end up being pretty convincing promoters for most people to do whatever it is someone in authority tells you to do. But herein lays the key. Did you hear what I said? You might have caught something. I said someone in authority. And I was speaking, obviously, about Pharaoh. Now, did he have authority? Some of you did say yes, I think. Some of you might be tempted to say yes. But the answer is no. No, he did not have authority. He might have had power, great sway. My gosh, he had an incredible army with chariots and charioteers. He had incredible force. And so when it came to the Israelites doing what he commanded of them, it had nothing to do with his authority, because he had none. It was the incredible human force and power behind his commands which scared them into submission. And so really the Israelites were not being obedient to Pharaoh because he had no authority which garnered obedience. They were not being obedient. They were just being compliant out of fear. Compliance is not really the same as obedience. We comply when we don't want to lose our earthly life. We obey when we don't want to lose our eternal life. Is this fear tactic, slave drivers and strong armies waiting in the wings to smite us, is this really the approach of our loving God? Yes, we are to fear him. Fear his power, which means we respect it. We don't tremble in timidity. We rejoice that he has this kind of power, the power to create, the power to give us life, to save us from our sins. And because he has the power to do these and many other things, which he has proven time and time again, he has power to do all things, we recognize that true authority rests in him. As the author of life and all that is, he has the authority. And because he is God, he can extend his authority to whomever he wishes. Again, as we've seen many times over, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Aaron, David, Moses, Andrew, Thomas, James, John, Peter, to whom he gave the keys to the kingdom, a set of keys which has been passed down through an unbroken line of apostolic succession. So I have a great little book. I didn't bring it with me, but I'm glad I transcribed the words from it. It's by Scepter Publishing, called Conversations with Jose Maria Escrivá. And in it is a transcripted interview between this great saint of the church and a man by the name of Pedro Rodriguez, who was otherwise inconsequential. Anyhow, this specific interview is entitled Freedom and Pluralism in the People of God. And so during this interview, Pedro asks Jose Maria a series of questions regarding some very fundamental, but at the time, highly contested realities of the church. And so keep in mind, this was in 1967 that this interview took place. And so Vatican II had just wrapped up. So many people were still trying to figure out what happened there. I think some of us, to a large degree, are still trying to figure out what happened there. And so the first of Pedro's questions was rather basic, but still extremely enlightening. And he wanted Jose Maria to supply his own definition of aggiornamento. It's an Italian word, which literally means bringing up to date, one which was used over and over again in the many sessions of the council. And so, in light of its frequent usage, the interviewer asks him, in your opinion, what is the real meaning of this word in the life of the church? To which Escrivá says, faithfulness. Aggiornamento, as I see it, means above all faithfulness. A husband, a soldier, an administrator who faithfully fulfills each moment in each new circumstance of his life the duties of love and justice which he once took on will always be just that much better a husband, soldier, or administrator. It is difficult to keep this keen sense of loyalty constantly active, as it is always difficult to apply a principle to the changing realities of the contingent world. But it is the best defense against aging of the spirit, hardening of the heart, and stiffening of the mind. And he goes on for some time, poetically rather, to explain his otherwise one-word answer, faithfulness. First word he said. But it's his answer to his next question, which I think serves us very well today, if that didn't already. And not just for you and I here this morning, but I think for the universal church. You know, these are words, again, uttered 50 years ago. But boy, do they hit home in 2019. And so let me read for you the entire question first, which in itself is a bit long, but it helps, I think it really helps to understand his answer. And so Pedro asks, the Second Vatican Council has often used the expression people of God to designate the church. It has thus clearly shown the common responsibility of all Christians in the single mission of this people of God. What, in your opinion, should be the characteristics of the necessary public opinion in the church, of which Pius XII already spoke, in order to reflect effectively this common responsibility? How is the phenomenon of public opinion in the church affected by the particular relationships of authority and obedience which exist in the heart of the Christian community? I know it's a long question. I'd be freaking out if I was asked that so much. I don't know how to respond. But Escrivá, he did. He knew how to respond. Quote, I do not think there can be such a thing as truly Christian obedience unless that obedience is voluntary and responsible. The children of God are not stones. They are not corpses. They are intelligent and free beings, and all of them have been raised to the same supernatural order as those who hold authority. But no one can use his intelligence and freedom properly, whether it be to obey or to give an opinion, unless he has acquired an adequate Christian education. The problem of necessary public opinion in the church is fundamentally the same as the problem of the doctrinal training of the faithful. Certainly, the Holy Spirit distributes his abundant gifts among the members of the people of God, all of whom are responsible for the mission of the church. But far from exempting anyone from the obligation of acquiring adequate doctrinal training, his action makes it more pressing. By doctrine, I mean the knowledge which each person should have of the mission of the church as a whole and of his particular role, his specific responsibilities in that mission. This, as the Holy Father has frequently reminded us, is the colossal task of education which the church must undertake in the post-conciliar period. The solution to the problem which you mention, as well as to other yearnings which are felt today in the heart of the church, depends directly, I feel, on how well this task is done. End quote. So, 50 years later, how well do you honestly think we have completed this task? How well do Catholics know their faith? I imagine for most of you sitting here, you know it pretty well. Or you know it well enough and care about it enough that you come to things like this. You go to talks, you make retreats, you engage in Bible studies, you actually crack open the catechism. Many of you go to daily masses. Far and away, so much more than what most Catholics do. Because the sad thing is, and this isn't news, most Catholics do not even go to Mass, let alone pray grace before meals. That would be a big deal if they started doing that, some of them. Most are not practicing. And so guess what their children end up doing if they don't contracept or abort them first? Not practicing their faith. But it's not a matter of not practicing a faith they know and love. They don't know it. Their parents don't know it. Catechism. Cat a what? And if you don't know something, how could you ever love it? If we don't know God, how could we possibly love him? If we don't know what the Catholic Church is and understand the authority which has been given to her by God, it just becomes that thing that takes the family away from soccer games on Sunday morning. And for the rest of the week, just really cramps your style. Assuming the family is doing anything together. Not only do you not love it, you learn to hate it. A ridiculous number of baptized Catholics are out there hating the church, for what they think she is. Only very few hate her for what she truly is. But who in the world do you think is spreading the inaccuracies? Who do you think is running their mouths at a bar somewhere, polluting what might be an otherwise open mind sitting on the stool right next to them? A soul looking for direction, not indoctrinated by any false teachings about the church. You guessed it, fallen away Catholics, non-practicing Catholics who never learned their faith. And so they have an opinion for sure. Who doesn't? And one they are happy to share with anyone who will listen, but one often that is a far cry from the protection and the salvation, the love and the mercy, the peace and the freedom which comes from remaining obedient to Christ and his church, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, through which the immutable authority of God is communicated to a people peculiarly his own. I think I know how we got here. I think I know where it all fell apart, actually, in the home. But I also think that's exactly where we need to pick up the pieces and start fresh. And so the people who didn't come to hear this reflection, I say, of course they're not here to hear it, but to them, wives, love your husbands. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and handed himself over for her. Love your children. Be an example of honor for them as you honor each other. If we can get the family unit looking again like the domestic church it is meant to be, then going to church and desiring to be well instructed in the faith will come naturally, if not supernaturally. A proclivity to obedience, not disobedience. A proclivity to obedience might very well seep back into the minds and hearts of the world around us. Earlier I said I can't express how truly freeing obedience is for me. I find that most priests I talk to, those who have a well-formed prayer life and a rule of life, say the very same thing. So as a priest, my obedience breaks down like this. But for you and for anybody else, just insert your vocation where you hear me speak of mine. And it should map on pretty well. At least I hope it does. So I recognize that I am to be obedient to God, who has authority over me because he created me. Therefore, I desire to be obedient to his most holy will, which, generally speaking, is communicated to me and to all peoples through the commandments, the dogmas, doctrines, and teachings of his church. And so I decided the most effective way for me to do that was to be obedient to his specific will in my life. My vocation to the priesthood, which wasn't a flippant response, something he communicated to me through much prayer. And so through this rather formal obedience to his chosen vocation for me, his overarching plan for me, the rest of his particular will for me in my life has become exponentially easier for me. It's become joyful. Now, life isn't always easy. The priesthood comes with many ups and downs. I would be lying if I said it didn't. But I sleep pretty well at night. I do. Knowing that whatever I didn't get to today, I can get to tomorrow. Knowing that wherever I am and whatever I'm doing, to a large degree, was not decided by me. I didn't have to make that decision. I go where the bishop tells me. I offer Mass the way the liturgical books of the Church instruct me. I believe what God has told me through the prophets of old, the lives of the saints, most especially through his Son, Jesus Christ. And I promise you, I have never experienced more peace in my life, and I have never, ever been more free.